Good day, everybody, and welcome back to the channel. Well, if you might remember the video where I received a package in the mail from Vincent Sclafani, and it was this typewriter. This is a Remington Monarch branded as a Singer Graduate. It's manufactured in France in the year 1963, and I made an unboxing video about it earlier. I'll drop a link down below to that one if you haven't seen it. But today's video, we're going to look a little bit more closely at the Remington Monarch. Stay tuned. The Singer Graduate is a rebrand of the Remington Monarch, and it has the serial number prefix of TRM, and all of the TRM Remington Monarch machines were made in 1963. So if you have a TRM prefix, it's 1963. This machine was made in France. We'll start with our overview of the Monarch. On the left side of the carriage, the line spacing selector has 5 settings: 1, 1.5, 2, 2.5, and 3. It's one of the few portables of this size that I know of with that many line spacing selections. And behind the carriage return lever itself is this lever right here. This is the disconnect for the line spacing variable. This is what you might call the temporary disconnect. If you flip it back to the ratcheted mode, it'll return to its same line spacing. Whereas with the end of the platen knob, you have the permanent line spacing disconnect, where you can permanently change the line spacing relative to the platen. The machine has a carriage release lever on both the left and the right side, which is quite nice. And turning to the back of the machine, we have our press and slide margin adjustments. Very similar to a lot of other kinds of machines with this kind of margin setting. And also, kind of hidden out of the way are these 2 little paper support fingers. This is the telescoping so-called rabbit ear style. But I will say on this particular model, it's a little bit more difficult to deploy them. You have to kind of get your fingernail in both of them like that to be able to raise them up. And they are a little bit thinner sheet metal than some of the other brands that we've come to see. So you have to be careful that you don't forget that they are deployed and flip the machine over and perhaps bend or break them, but they are there, they are useful. Moving on now to the right side of the carriage. We have the right side carriage release lever and the right side platen knob, and we have the paper release lever, which pulls toward the operator, to release the tension on the feed rollers. And when you do that, it does raise up the paper bale slightly. Both the paper bale and the paper table have a paper scale on them that corresponds to each other, which is a nice feature. And of course, the paper bale does have 2 rubber rollers. An overview of the keyboard starts on the upper left side, where you have the tabulator clear and set control. Backspace lever is right next to it with the right pointing arrow key. And then you have a standard American keyboard. Well, pretty close to standard. There are a few differences, but it's pretty much a standard American keyboard, lacking the number 1 key, of course, because of its age. And on the right side of the keyboard, you have the tabulator button itself and the bichrome setting down here next to the plus equals key, which is one of those rather unusual keys. You don't see a plus equals all the time, and even less common is this division symbol, and the shifted character is a degree symbol. So degree and division symbol. So if you look at the features on the character set, you'll have plus, minus, division, an X for multiplication, an equal sign, a degree sign. Maybe this keyboard was used for some kind of engineering or technical work. It's hard to say. But one of the things that's rather unique about the Monarch here is the carriage lock lever or switch is right here in the right side of the front bezel. You push it down to lock the carriage, and it is a positive lock. It truly does lock it and protect the escapement, and you flip it up like that to release it so you can operate the machine. So I really like the location of that switch. It's right in the front, and it does truly lock the carriage. And right next to the Singer branding on the other side of the front bezel is a touch control, and it's really like a 3-position. There's low at the top, medium in the middle, and higher touch on the bottom. I'm currently using it at the low setting, and it feels just fine to me. These chiclet-shaped keys that Remington has on these machines are very distinctively Remington. The sides of the keys are straight, but the tops and bottoms are curved, with the bottom of the key or the front side toward the operator being more curved than the rear. And there's a slight depression on the key face for your finger. It's a circular depression. They are quite comfortable, actually. And there's also a underneath part of the keys, this darker part, plastic, that kind of stays invisible. You don't really see it as much, and it kind of keeps your finger from, if you slip off one of the keys, it kind of protects your finger from getting caught in the linkages and the levers down there. So I kind of like that. And it has a nice handsome space bar, very functional, works quite well. And a little stylish styling function I think is pretty cool is the 2 front corners are slightly beveled back compared to the rear corners. There's a slight bevel on both of those corners, and I just find that is a very interesting stylistic touch. And speaking of stylistic touch, I find this Monarch to be very handsome overall in its styling, and actually quite impressive in its build quality as well. The ribbon cover is removed by pulling up on the 2 front corners of the cover and then pulling toward you, and it releases, very similar to an Olivetti type cover. And it has these little hooks that hook underneath the body. Here's a molding mark right here. They're cast alloy instead of stamped sheet metal, so a little bit nicer construction, I think. And even looking at the thickness of some of the panels, it's quite impressive. So this machine, being a Remington-made machine, has the typical Remington-shaped spools, which is quite nice. So to change the ribbon, you pull the top cover off, and then you can pull out the ribbon off of its inner metal core, and that enables you to change the ribbon quite handily. The bottom part of the spool stays on the machine itself. Over here on the left side, this little lever back here, this is a manual ribbon reversing lever that you can use to manually reverse the direction of the ribbon, but you shouldn't need it because the ribbon reversing system on these portable Remingtons, when you get near the middle of the ribbon pack, there is the little tension arm, which you might not be able to see, that tension arm right there. When the tension arm leans in toward the core far enough, it triggers the reversing. So it does not use eyelets, which is an interesting system, and thus far it's been working fine. The Monarch is a segment shift machine, or basket shift. Here you can see me pushing the left-hand shift button, and here is the shift lock. The shifting will release the shift lock with either the left or the right shift key. And the shifting is quite light on this machine. When I took this machine apart to clean it and service it, I was pretty impressed with the fact that all of the body panels, not just the ribbon cover, are made from cast alloy rather than stamped sheet metal, and they're quite a bit thicker than you might expect from the competing American brands like Smith Corona 5 Series or the Royal Quiet Deluxes. These are cast alloy, quite a bit thicker, and I really like the construction of the body panels. So the only body panels that aren't made of cast alloy are this back panel underneath the carriage, the 2 carriage end caps, and your little paper table, erasing table, and then this back panel where the margin settings are. Those are stamped sheet metal, but everything else is cast alloy. One thing I've noticed about feeding paper into the Monarch is that you have to lower the bottom edge of the paper quite a bit before it hits the feed rollers. The feed rollers are further down than on a lot of machines, so if I mark this like right here, you can see it's nearly 2 inches or maybe 50 millimeters or so between the bottom edge when it first grips the feed rollers and up here where the paper begins to show. When you are getting to the end of the page, it seems to grab a hold of the paper nicely right about there is when it slipped, and I'm going to mark that typing line. So it looks like less than an inch, maybe about 15 millimeters or so. So the feed rollers are located a little more toward the bottom front of the platen, which makes it grip the paper better toward the end. The on-feet in motion for controlling the shifting of the lower and upper case are controlled by adjusting these two eccentric screws, this one here being the lower case and this one up here being the upper case. I haven't had to make any adjustments to the escapement mechanism, but it does look quite a bit different than a lot of other escapements I've seen. And one of the things I noticed mostly, there's a lot of adjustment screws in the escapement here. So it looks to me like plenty of room for tweaking and customizing the action of this machine rather than just relying on wear and or bending of parts. And speaking of adjustability, if you're one of those people that likes to have a precisely adjusted card guide so it precisely marks the bottom of your printing line, you'll be happy to know that by putting the segment into the shift mode, you have ready access to these two screws that you can loosen, and you can change the height and the angle of the card guide to perfectly match the printing line to suit your needs. Well, with medium-sized portables, I'm often curious whether it'll take a number 10 envelope, because being able to do so makes it very useful for letter writing. I've measured the platen's length, and it is 9 1/8 inches or 233 millimeters from tip of the rubber to tip of the rubber here. The paper guide is right here, and it'll go to the left of the paper guide about another maybe 7 or 8 millimeters. So I'm going to push it all the way over there. I have a number 10 envelope here, and I'm going to try to push it up against the paper guide here as much as I can. Now, it will slip initially, it won't grab, so I'm going to open up the feed rollers and push it a little bit further enough for it'll grip. And now it does grip and it does feed through there. So we can get to within really close to the left edge, which is really good for addressing your return address here. It's a little fiddly, but it technically will take number 10 envelopes. Well, by the time 1963 rolled around and this machine was made, Smith Corona had already migrated from their 5 series to the 6 series. So this is not exactly a contemporary comparison, but it's pretty close in terms of the size of the machines and the general features. I thought it would be fun to compare the Silent Super. This happens to be a 1954 Silent Super. You've seen it before on the channel. This, of course, is 1963, so 9 years difference. Well, let's see. They both have paper bales with rubber rollers. The Silent Super has 3, at least the ones for that year. And this has 2 rubber rollers on its paper bale. The Remington has a scale on the paper bale, whereas the Silent Super doesn't. And they both have a scale back on the paper table. However, the Smith Corona has an additional scale down here near the bottom of the platen that the Remington doesn't have. They both have manual ribbon reversing levers. The Silent Super's here and the Remington's is under the hood. They both have a bichrome setting on the right side of the carriage. They both have tabs, tab set in clear here and here, and they both have an older American style keyboard lacking the number 1, of course. So they're very similar. I think one of the major differences is the Silent Super only has 1, 2, and 3 whole line spacing, whereas the Remington has 1.5 and 2.5 as well. And also the Silent Super has that end of page system on the left end of the platen, whereas the Remington doesn't have the end of page system. One other difference, of course, is that the Remington is a true half space machine. It spaces a half a character space as the type bar nears the platen, and it finishes the other half as it exits the platen, whereas the Smith Corona is a typical American machine in the sense that it does whole spacing only, at least a typical machine for this era. And another little difference I should point out is the Remington's carriage return lever will fold down like that to be flush with the ribbon cover, whereas on the Smith Coronas they do not fold down. And you don't want to try it, otherwise you'll bend it, and when you bend it, it'll of course scratch the paint job on the ribbon cover. And the other significant difference I should point out is, of course, the Smith Coronas had the easy to remove and install platen system, whereas the Remington is more of a traditional make in that it needs to be disassembled from the machine instead. Both machines are fairly easy to service in terms of gaining access underneath. They're both very similar in the sense that their undercarriages are easily exposed, and the guts of the machines, like the escapement mechanism, are readily accessible. They're not hidden behind a row of linkages, for instance, like some other brands. Well, the keyboards sit at different heights on both machines. The keyboard is lower on the Remington and it sits higher on the Smith Corona. In addition, the QWERTY row on the Smith Corona measures about 205 millimeters wide from the left end of the Q to the right side of the fraction key, whereas on the Remington it's 195 millimeters from the left side of the Q key to the right side of this key over here. So a little bit tighter, more cramped keyboard on the Remington, so indicative of a slightly smaller machine. Well, one of Smith Corona's selling points on their keyboards for the 5 Series machines, the surface of the keycaps would stay level throughout the entire keystroke instead of pivoting down and not remaining horizontal. Well, I can say on the Remington, it's the same way. It stays horizontal throughout the entire keystroke. The difference is the Smith Coronas traces a curved arc with a keycap like the way your finger moves, whereas the Remington, while the keycaps stay horizontal throughout their entire travel, they trace more of a straight down path with a slight arc going back this way, rather than this curved path that follows the fingertip like that on the Smith Corona. And by the way, I should mention that because it is branded as a Singer Graduate, and I remember that classical movie called The Graduate with the Simon and Garfunkel tune Mrs. Robinson, well, I've decided, even though I don't really name all of my typewriters, I've decided that this typewriter here will be called Mrs. Robinson. And it just so happens the blue Samsonite suitcase that I pulled out of my storage room to use as a carrying case for this, yeah, the suitcase says M.R. Mrs. Robinson. One of the things I became aware of after I received this typewriter from Vincent was I really haven't had a Remington in my collection before. Either the really small, noiseless portables from the 30s or the full-size standard, noiseless, or anything else like that. And that's kind of a shame. But this is a really good typewriter. I really love it. It's built surprisingly well compared against its contemporaries, and I do really like the touch or the feel of this machine. So I need to work more with this typewriter, continue typing with it more to get a better feel for it. But right now, I'm very impressed. That's my initial impressions. We need to stay creative, of course, and you know how I always end these videos. That's right. Stay creative and have yourselves a great day, and bye-bye for now.